being a wildlife photographer is incredibly rewarding, but you know, it also comes with a few challenges here and there. And with those challenges in mind, I am sharing with you my top 8 tips for wildlife photographers coming up next. Yep, that's right. I'm lying down on the job here. One of the things I really like to do is to get eye level with my subjects. Now in this case, I'm actually shooting, I think they're moths, but it's like they're picking up moisture from the road. I'm going to show it here now. Anyway, to get a really good background separation from your subject, it's usually a very good idea to get down to eye level. So in this case, I'm using like this little set of baby legs, if you will. And oh, and actually, you know what, I'm going to throw in a couple of hints in just this tip alone. So yeah, so I'm using these baby legs. Now you can use a bean bag as well, and I suppose you could use the ground too if you had to. But I really like these baby legs because it allows me to get down really quite low. And then on here, the tripod head, this is actually a video head, and it has a 100 millimeter bowl on it. And what I like about that is I can use, you probably can't see it, but there's like a little dial here that I can level the tripod head with. So I don't have to worry about getting the legs straight all the time. Anyway, this tip, now I got sidetracked, but this tip is basically to get down eye level with your subject. Now that's not always going to be the case. Let's say that, you know, you're in the Masai Mara and you're up in a hot air balloon and you're shooting down. Obviously you're not going to be, eye level. And there's other times where you don't want to be eye level. Maybe you want to be below eye level. For example, if you're shooting remotely, I might add, but if you're taking a shot of a grizzly bear and you want to get that really imposing look in your image, well, then you want to be down low and you want to be shooting up high. But generally speaking, I think it's a good idea to be eye level with your subject, just because it does isolate whatever it is you're shooting from the background and draws attention to your subject, which is arguably where, of course, it should be. So another thing I like to use is a remote release. Now in this case, it's a wireless remote, but it doesn't have to be. It can be a wired remote as well. And the reason for that is, how many times have you been out in the field and you're waiting for something to happen? Maybe you're at an osprey nest and you're waiting for one of the parents to come home with dinner. So there's a lot of waiting. There's often a lot of waiting. And then all of a sudden the action happens. Now, without these remote releases, of course, you have to handle your camera. But in this case, I could have my camera pointed at the nest, and then as the parent comes in with food, all I have to do is press the trigger. And in fact, with these little moth things here, sorry, I don't know what they're called, but that's what I'm doing. I'm waiting for something to maybe fly in, or maybe for two of them to get close together. And I've already pre-focused the camera. So then all I need to do is press this shutter button, and I don't have to touch my setup whatsoever. Do you ever sit at home on the couch and think, oh gee, if there's only something I could go and shoot? I certainly do. And sometimes what I'll do is I'll go back to a spot I've gone to many times before. Lack of a better phrase, let's just call it, an ordinary spot. And I'll try and shoot this ordinary subject, if you will, in a new and different way than I've ever done before. So maybe you'll do extreme close-up. Maybe you just, you're really patient and you wait for something unique to happen. It happened here with these herons a few years ago, and I'd gone to this spot quite a few times before, but I never really just sat there and observed the herons for a while. And then this time when I went, I got some behavior that I'd never gotten before. So that's the first benefit. And the other benefit is that it helps you keep your sort of skills up to date, if you will. So the idea is, go to an ordinary spot. Maybe it's your local duck pond. Maybe it's a river estuary or something like that. And then take your quote unquote ordinary subject and try and turn it into something extraordinary. That's the goal. And you think you'll find that quite rewarding. This next one might sound a little bit scary, but it actually isn't. And that is to shoot in manual mode. And I mean full manual mode, not auto ISO. So this tip could generate a few comments down below, I suspect. Anyway, the idea is you control aperture, you control ISO, and you control shutter speed. And the one caveat with this tip is that you need to have constant light. So on a day like today, you can see these clouds up there. So if the clouds all of a sudden cover the sun, well, that changes the amount of light on the subject. And I would have to change my settings as well. But if you haven't done it before, I suggest you try it at home. Maybe you have a pet, a dog in the backyard you can practice on. But just keep in mind that you want to use your histogram. And if the light changes, you want to dial in your settings a little bit different. But try it. I don't think you'll regret it. I'd say I'll probably shoot in around, 90-95% manual mode now. Yeah, so just give it a try. So I just realized on that last tip, manual mode, I never gave you the why. Why do it? And the reason is the following. If you leave the metering up to your camera, without going into sort of a long story, your camera that is, has a method of calculating the amount of light that should be in the scene. And if you leave the metering up to your camera, it will often average out the amount of light on the scene. But really what we care about is the amount of light that falls on your subject. And that's why I mentioned before about the changing light. But if the light on your subject doesn't change, and you dial in your settings to that, then it doesn't matter what happens to the background. Maybe it's super bright, maybe it's dark, but what will happen is if you leave the metering to your camera, it'll change the settings based on usually the whole scene. And what you want to have the meeting, sorry, I'm out of breath because I'm up at altitude, but what you want your camera to do is to maintain the adequate light on your subject, no matter, this is the subject, no matter if it goes up against a bright background or down against something that's darker. What matters is the amount of light that falls on your subject. Here's your, eagle or something. But I think you get the idea. And when you set your camera to manual mode, it doesn't matter what the background is because you've dialed in your exposure for your subject using a combination of ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. So that's the why. Let's move on to camera gear. And does it matter? Yeah, absolutely it matters. But maybe it doesn't matter as much as you think it does. I mean, there are definitely circumstances where you need to have long glass, for example. Let's say you're photographing grizzly bears up in Alaska or here in British Columbia. You're not going to get away with a wide angle, at least not holding on to it. So you do have to invest money in camera gear. However, I will also say though that you can shoot or film wildlife with so many other pieces of gear. For example, well, in this case, I'm using my phone to record this, but I've used my phone for wildlife as well. And what I do is, I should have taken this out of my pocket before I started talking about this, but I will use a little remote. And with this, I can put my phone on a tripod, and then I can move back, and then I can trigger the camera with that little wireless remote that I just showed you. And of course, it's important that you make sure that whatever you're close to isn't going to get spooked by your phone being there. But I've done it with marmots. The marmot didn't care at all that my phone was there. So you can use your phone. You can also use action camera. Maybe you have like a GoPro or something like that. Those you can trigger with your phone wirelessly. So you can use that. If you have, wider lenses maybe, Same idea. You get a wireless remote, and you can order those for your camera, and they're not much, maybe, I don't know, 50, 60 US dollars. But the moral of the story, if you will, the whole idea behind this tip is that if you find that you don't have, the latest and greatest and, the longest lenses, please don't despair. You just have to be creative and then accept, maybe there's some species that you won't be able to get yet with the gear that you have, but there's so many things, so many other things you can do. And you know what? I also want to say that it's good if you're creative. It's good if you look, at the person in the mirror and maybe take that person to task as opposed to what's in your, in your camera bag. So just try to get creative with what you have until, if you're lacking something, until you're able to purchase that piece of gear that's going to answer, your desires, if you will. So be creative, use your head, come up with new ideas, come up with new ways of doing things. Of course, above all else, respect to wildlife, for sure. I mean, that's why we do this. But yeah, that's the end of this one. I'll stop now. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep rambling on. So I'm out scouting for loons, and there's two over that way, but I just want to see how they are with me in the kayak here. Anyway, just in further regard to what we just talked about with equipment, I just want to mention something about zoom lenses. Now, if you're using a zoom lens like a 100 to 500, 200 to 600, 200 to 800 or something like that, the suggestion I'll give you is to make sure that you're shooting basically wide, middle ground, and at full focal length. I know I have a tendency to shoot at full focal length, and I use prime lenses a lot, so you don't really have much choice. But when you're shooting with a zoom, it allows you to frame your shots in a bunch of different ways. And particularly if you're going to be doing some storytelling, it's really, really important that you use your wide shots to set the scene, and then you bring the viewer in closer and closer and closer to your subject. It's something that's super important in filmmaking, in wildlife filmmaking. So you'll see a lot of filmmaking crews, they're using zoom lenses, and it's just so they can shoot wide. And then, as I said before, you come in, middle ground, and then, your close-ups. So if you're using a zoom lens, just make sure you're using it from wide to narrow. And let's talk about composition for a quick moment. You have probably heard of something called the rule of thirds, and it's not something I'm going to spend a lot of time on, but it is something that does help with composition. So if you're not really sure how to compose a shot, the rule of thirds is something that you can use quite easily. And just to recap, it's basically the idea of you overlay like a tic-tac-toe grid on your image, and then you move your subject into one of the intersecting lines. I'm going to throw up an example here so you can see what I mean. But it's a quick and easy way that you can compose a shot. Now they call it the rule of third. I kind of refer to it as a guide to third, because I don't think it's not something that you want to stick to all the time. You want to experiment with your compositions, but certainly if you're taking insurance shots and whatnot, it's a pretty nice and quick and easy way that you can get a pleasant composition out of your images. So yesterday out in the kayak, I recorded tip number 8, and this morning as I'm sitting here editing the video, I realized that, well, tip 1 through 7 probably won't do you a lot of good if you actually can't find wildlife. So I'm changing number 8, and that's why you're watching me sitting at home. Finding wildlife can often be very difficult. And this is another topic I could probably dedicate a whole new video to as well. But the number one thing that really has helped me in the field finding wildlife is my ears. And you may have thought I was going to say my eyes, but it's actually my ears that have helped a lot. And some species are easy. So, you know, if you're out looking for bald eagles are quite big, so it's relatively easy to spot them. But what about something like a pygmy owl? You know, pygmy owls are size of a grapefruit, and they're not always easy to find. In fact, they're rarely easy to find. But the one thing that does make that easier is if you know the sound they make. So this tip is all about sound. Many times when I'm in a wildlife environment, I'll often just sit and listen. So I'll sit for, I don't know, 5, 10, 15 minutes and just use my ears. And it really helps to know what you're listening for. So I mentioned pygmy owls, but it can be a multitude of other species. So my tip to you in that regard is when you are out looking for wildlife, just sit down and listen. And that's going to help you greatly. Anyhow, that takes us to the end of the video. So thanks for watching. I hope you got some helpful hints out of it. As always, please hit the like and subscribe button, you know, all the regular stuff. And if you have some ideas on videos that you'd like to see me do, please put those down in the comments. It's always nice to know what helps people the most. Last and not least, I will also ask you to be an ambassador for wildlife. With all the challenges facing wildlife out there, it's important that we all use our voice and advocate for the animals that obviously can't speak for themselves. Thanks for watching. See you next time.